Chapter 6. Teddy Kent and Ilsa Burnley came home in the summer for a brief vacation. Teddy had won an art scholarship, which meant 2 years in Paris, and was to sail for Europe in 2 weeks. He had written the news to Emily in an offhand way, and she had responded with the congratulations of a friend and sister. There was no reference in either letter to Rainbow Gold or Vega of the Lyre, yet Emily looked forward to his coming with a wistful, ashamed hope that would not be denied. Perhaps, dared she hope it, when they met again face to face in their old haunted woods and trysts, this coldness that had grown up so inexplicably between them would vanish as a sea fog vanishes when the sun rose over the gulf. No doubt Teddy had had his imitation love affairs, as she had hers, but when he came, when they looked again into each other's eyes, when she heard his signal whistle in Lofty John's bush. But she never heard it. On the evening of the day when she knew Teddy was expected home, she walked in the garden among brocaded moths, wearing a new gown of powder blue chiffon, and listened for it. Every robin call brought the blood to her cheek, and made her heart beat wildly. Then came Aunt Laura through the dew and dusk. "Teddy and Ilsa are here," she said. Emily went into the stately, stiff, dignified parlor of New Moon, pale, queenly, aloof. Ilsa hurled herself upon her with all her old tempestuous affection, but Teddy shook hands with a cool detachment that almost equaled her own. Teddy? Oh dear, no. Frederick Kent, R.A. to be. What was there left of the old Teddy in this slim, elegant young man, with his sophisticated air and cool, impersonal eyes, and general implication of having put off forever all childish things, including foolish old visions and insignificant little country girls he had played with in his infancy? In which conclusion Emily was horribly unjust to Teddy, but she was not in a mood to be just to anybody. Nobody is who has just made a fool of herself, and Emily felt that that was just what she had done, again, mooning romantically about in a twilight garden, specially wearing powder blue, waiting for a lover's signal from a beau who had forgotten all about her, or only remembered her as an old schoolmate on whom he had very properly and kindly and conscientiously come to call. Well, thank heaven, Teddy did not know how absurd she had been. She would take excellent care that he should never suspect it. Who could be more friendly and remote than a Murray of New Moon? Emily's manner, she flattered herself, was admirable, as gracious and impersonal as to an entire stranger. Renewed congratulations on his wonderful success, coupled with an absolute lack of all real interest in it, carefully phrased, polite questions about his work on her side, carefully phrased, polite questions about her work on his side. She had seen some of his pictures in the magazines. He had read some of her stories. So it went, with a wider gulf opening between them at every moment. Never had Emily felt herself so far away from Teddy. She recognized with a feeling that was almost terror how completely he had changed in those 2 years of absence. It would, in truth, have been a ghastly interview had it not been for Ilsa, who chattered with all her old breeziness and tang, planning out 2 weeks of gay doings while she was home, asking hundreds of questions, the same lovable old madcap of laughter and jest, and dressed with all her old gorgeous violations of accepted canons of taste. In an extraordinary dress, a thing of greenish yellow. She had a big pink peony at her waist and another at her shoulder. She wore a bright green hat with a wreath of pink flowers on it. Great hoops of pearl swung in her ears. It was a weird costume. No one but Ilsa could have worn it successfully, and she looked like the incarnation of 1,000 tropic springs in it. Exotic, provocative, beautiful. So beautiful. Emily realized her friend's beauty afresh, with a pang, not of envy, but of bitter humiliation. Beside Ilsa's golden sheen of hair and brilliance of amber eyes and red rose loveliness of cheeks, she must look pale and dark and insignificant. Of course, Teddy was in love with Ilsa. He had gone to see her first, had been with her while Emily waited for him in the garden. Well, it made no real difference. Why should it? She would be just as friendly as ever, and was friendly with a vengeance. But when Teddy and Ilsa had gone, together, laughing and teasing each other through the old Tomorrow Road, Emily went up to her room and locked the door. Nobody saw her again until the next morning. The gay 2 weeks of Ilsa's planning followed. Picnics, dances, and jamborees galore. Shrewsbury Society decided that a rising young artist was somebody to be taken notice of, and took notice accordingly. It was a veritable whirl of gaiety, and Emily whirled about in it with the others. No step lighter in the dance, no voice quicker in the jest, and all the time feeling like the miserable spirit in a ghost story she had once read, who had a live coal in its breast instead of a heart. All the time feeling, too, far down under surface pride and hidden pain, that sense of completion and fulfillment which always came to her when Teddy was near her. But she took good care never to be alone with Teddy, who certainly could not be accused of any attempt to inveigle her into twosomes. His name was freely coupled with Ilsa's, and they took so composedly the teasing they encountered that the impression gained ground that things were pretty well understood between them. Emily thought Ilsa might have told her if it were so, but Ilsa, though she told many a tale of lovers forlorn whose agonies seemed to lie very lightly on her conscience, never mentioned Teddy's name, which Emily thought had a torturing significance of its own. She inquired after Perry Miller, wanting to know if he were as big an oaf as ever, and laughing over Emily's indignant defense. "He will be premier some day, no doubt," agreed Ilsa scornfully. "He'll work like the devil and never miss anything by lack of asking for it, but won't you always smell the herring barrels of Stovepipe Town?" Perry came to see Ilsa, bragged a bit too much over his progress, and got so snubbed and manhandled that he did not come again. Altogether, the 2 weeks seemed a nightmare to Emily, who thought she was unreservedly thankful when the time came for Teddy to go. He was going on a sailing vessel to Halifax, wanting to make some nautical sketches for a magazine, and an hour before flood tide, while the Mira Lee swung at anchor by the wharf at Stovepipe Town, he came to say goodbye. He did not bring Ilsa with him, no doubt, thought Emily, because Ilsa was visiting in Charlottetown. But Dean Priest was there, so there was no dreaded solitude adieu. Dean was creeping back into his own after the 2 weeks' junketings from which he had been barred out. Dean would not go to dances and clam bakes, but he was always hovering in the background, as everybody concerned felt. He stood with Emily in the garden, and there was a certain air of victory and possession about him that did not escape Teddy's eye. Dean, who never made the mistake of thinking gaiety was happiness, had seen more than others of the little drama that had been played out in Blair Water during those 2 weeks, and the dropping of the curtain left him a satisfied man. The old, shadowy, childish affair between Teddy Kent of the Tansy Patch and Emily of New Moon was finally ended. Whatever its significance, or lack of significance, had been, Dean no longer counted Teddy among his rivals. Emily and Teddy parted with the hearty handshake and mutual good wishes of old schoolmates who do, indeed, wish each other well, but have no very vital interest in the matter. "Prosper and be hanged to you," as some old Murray had been wont to say. Teddy got himself away very gracefully. He had the gift of making an artistic exit, but he did not once look back. Emily turned immediately to Dean and resumed the discussion which Teddy's coming had interrupted. Her lashes hid her eyes very securely. Dean, with his uncanny ability to read her thoughts, should not, must not guess. What? What was there to guess? Nothing, absolutely nothing. Yet Emily kept her lashes down. When Dean, who had some other engagement that evening, went away half an hour later, she paced sedately up and down among the gold of primroses for a little while, the very incarnation, in all seeming, of maiden meditation fancy-free. "Spinning out a plot, no doubt," thought Cousin Jimmy proudly, as he glimpsed her from the kitchen window. "It beats me how she does it." Perhaps Emily was spinning out a plot, but as the shadows deepened, she slipped out of the garden, through the dreamy peace of the old Columbine orchard, along the yesterday road, over the green pasture field, past the Blair water, up the hill beyond, past the disappointed house, through the thick fir wood. There, in a clump of silver birches, one had an unbroken view of the harbor, flaming in lilac and rose color. Emily reached it a little breathlessly. She had almost run at the last. Would she be too late? Oh, what if she should be too late? The Mira Lee was sailing out of the harbor, a dream vessel in the glamour of sunset, past purple headlands and distant fairy-like misty coasts. Emily stood and watched her till she had crossed the bar into the gulf beyond. Stood and watched her until she had faded from sight in the blue dimness of the falling night, conscious only of a terrible hunger to see Teddy once more, just once more, to say goodbye as it should have been said. Teddy was gone, to another world. There was no rainbow in sight, and what was Vega of the Lyre but a whirling, flaming, incredibly distant sun? She slipped down among the grasses at her feet and lay there, sobbing in the cold moonshine that had suddenly taken the place of the friendly twilight. Mingled with her sharp agony was incredulity. This thing could not have happened. Teddy could not have gone away with only that soulless, chilly, polite goodbye, after all their years of comradeship, if nothing else. Oh, how would she ever get herself past 3 o'clock this night? "I am a hopeless fool," she whispered savagely. "He has forgotten. I am nothing to him, and I deserve it. Didn't I forget him in those crazy weeks when I was imagining myself in love with Aylmer Vincent? Of course, somebody has told him all about that. I've lost my chance of real happiness through that absurd affair. Where is my pride to cry like this over a man who has forgotten me? But it's so nice to cry after having had to laugh for these hideous weeks." Emily flung herself into work feverishly after Teddy had gone. Through long summer days and nights she wrote, while the purple stains deepened under her eyes and the rose stains faded out of her cheeks. Aunt Elizabeth thought she was killing herself, and for the first time was reconciled to her intimacy with Jarback Priest, since he dragged Emily away from her desk in the evenings, at least, for walks and talks in the fresh air. That summer, Emily paid off the last of her indebtedness to Uncle Wallace and Aunt Ruth with her pot boilers. But there was more than pot boiling a-doing. In her first anguish of loneliness, as she lay awake at 3 o'clock, Emily had remembered a certain wild winter night when she and Ilsa and Perry and Teddy had been stormed in the old John house on the Dairy Pond Road, remembered all the scandal and suffering that had arisen therefrom, and remembered also that night of rapt delight, thinking out a story that had flashed into her mind at a certain gay, significant speech of Teddy's. At least, she had thought it significant then. Well, that was all over, but wasn't the story somewhere? She had written the outline of that alluring, fanciful tale in a Jimmy book the next day. Emily sprang out of bed in the still summer moonlight, lighted one of the famous candles of New Moon, and rummaged through a pile of old Jimmy books. Yes, here it was, a cellar of dreams. Emily squatted down on her haunches and read it through. It was good. Again it seized hold of her imagination and called forth all her creative impulse. She would write it out. She would begin that very moment. Flinging a dressing gown over her white shoulders to protect them from the keen Gulf air, she sat down before her open window and began to write. Everything else was forgotten, for a time at least, in the subtle, all-embracing joy of creation. Teddy was nothing but a dim memory. Love was a blown-out candle, Nothing mattered but her story. The characters came to life under her hand and swarmed through her consciousness, vivid, alluring, compelling. Wit, tears, and laughter trickled from her pen. She lived and breathed in another world and came back to New Moon only at dawn to find her lamp burned out and her table littered with manuscript, the first 4 chapters of her book. Her book! What magic and delight and awe and incredulity in the thought! For weeks, Emily seemed to live really only when she was writing it. Dean found her strangely rapt and remote, absent and impersonal. Her conversation was as dull as it was possible for Emily's conversation to be. And while her body sat or walked beside him, her soul was where? In some region where he could not follow, at all events. It had escaped him. Emily finished her book in 6 weeks, finished it at dawn one morning. She flung down her pen and went to her window, lifting her pale, weary, triumphant little face to the skies of morning. Music was dripping through the leafy silence in Lofty John's bush. Beyond were dawn-rosy meadows and the garden of New Moon living in an enchanted calm. The wind's dance over the hills seemed some dear response to the music and rhythm in her being. Hills, sea, shadows, all called to her with 1,000 elfin voices of understanding and acclaim. The old gulf was singing. Exquisite tears were in her eyes. She had written it. Oh, how happy she was! This moment atoned for everything. Finished, complete, there it lay, A Cellar of Dreams, her first book. Not a great book, oh no, but hers, her very own, something to which she had given birth, which would never have existed had she not brought it into being. And it was good, she knew it was, felt it was. A fiery, delicate tale, instinct with romance, pathos, humor. The rapture of creation still illuminated it. She turned the pages over, reading a bit here and there, wondering if she could really have written that. She was right under the rainbow's end. Could she not touch the magic, prismatic thing? Already her fingers were clasping the pot of gold. Aunt Elizabeth walked in with her usual calm disregard of any useless formality such as knocking. "Emily," she said severely, "have you been sitting up all night again?" Emily came back to earth with that abominable mental jolt which can only be truly described as a thud, a sickening thud at that, very sickening. She stood like a convicted schoolgirl, and A Cellar of Dreams became instantly a mere heap of scribbled paper. I didn't realize how time was passing, Aunt Elizabeth," she stammered. "You are old enough to have better sense," said Aunt Elizabeth. "I don't mind your writing. Now, you seem to be able to earn a living by it in a very ladylike way. But you will wreck your health if you keep this sort of thing up. Have you forgotten your mother died of consumption? At any rate, don't forget that you must pick those beans today. It's high time they were picked." Emily gathered up her manuscript, with all her careless rapture gone. Creation was over. Remained now the sordid business of getting her book published. Emily typewrote it on the little third-hand machine Perry had picked up for her at an auction sale. A machine that wrote only half of any capital letter and wouldn't print the M's at all. She put the capitals and the M's in afterwards with the pen and sent the MS away to a publishing firm. The publishing firm sent it back with a typewritten screed saying that their readers had found some merit in the story, but not enough to warrant an acceptance. This, damning with faint praise, flattened Emily out as not even a printed slip could have done. Talk about 3 o'clock that night. No, it is an act of mercy not to talk about it, or about many successive 3 o'clocks. "Ambition," wrote Emily bitterly in her diary. "I could laugh. Where is my ambition now? What is it like to be ambitious? To feel that life is before you, a fair, unwritten white page where you may inscribe your name in letters of success. To feel that you have the wish and power to win your crown? To feel that the coming years are crowding to meet you and lay their largesse at your feet? I once knew what it was to feel so. All of which goes to show how very young Emily still was. But agony is none the less real because in later years, when we have learned that everything passes, we wonder what we agonized about. She had had a bad 3 weeks of it. Then she recovered enough to send her story out again. This time the publisher wrote to her that he might consider the book if she would make certain changes in it. It was too quiet. She must pep it up. And the ending must be changed entirely. It would never do. Emily tore his letter savagely into bits. Mutilate and degrade her story? Never. The very suggestion was an insult. When a third publisher sent it back with a printed slip, Emily's belief in it died. She tucked it away and took up her pen grimly. Well, I can write short stories at least. I must continue to do that. Nevertheless, the book haunted her. After a few weeks, she took it out and reread it, coolly, critically, free alike from the delusive glamour of her first rapture and from the equally delusive depression of rejection slips. And still, it seemed to her good. Not quite the wonder tale she had fancied it, perhaps, but still a good piece of work. What then? No writer, so she had been told, was ever capable of judging his own work correctly. If only Mr. Carpenter were alive, he would tell her the truth. Emily made a sudden, terrible resolution. She would show it to Dean. She would ask for his calm, unprejudiced opinion and abide by it. It would be hard. It was always hard to show her stories to anyone, most of all to Dean, who knew so much and had read everything in the world. But she must know, and she knew Dean would tell her the truth, good or bad. He thought nothing of her stories, but this was different. Would he not see something worthwhile in this? If not... Dean, I want your candid opinion about this story. Will you read it carefully and tell me exactly what you think of it? I don't want flattery or false encouragement. I want the truth, the naked truth.
Are you so sure of that? Asked Dean dryly. Very few people can endure seeing the naked truth. It has to have a rag or two to make it presentable.
I do want the truth, said Emily stubbornly. This book has been, she choked a little over the confession, refused 3 times. If you find any good in it, I'll keep on trying to find a publisher for it. If you condemn it, I'll burn it. Dean looked inscrutably at the little packet she held out to him. So this was what had wrapped her away from him all summer, absorbed her, possessed her. The one black drop in his veins, that priest jealousy of being first, suddenly made its poison felt. He looked into her cold, sweet face and starry eyes, gray-purple as a lake at dawn, and hated whatever was in the packet. But he carried it home and brought it back 3 nights later. Emily met him in the garden, pale and tense. Well, she said. Dean looked at her guiltily. How ivory white and exquisite she was in the chill dusk.
Faithful are the wounds of a friend. I should be less than your friend if I told you falsehoods about this, Emily.
So, it's no good.
It's a pretty little story, Emily. Pretty and flimsy and ephemeral as a rose-tinted cloud. Cobwebs, only cobwebs. The whole conception is too far-fetched. Fairy tales are out of the fashion, and this one of yours makes overmuch of a demand on the credulity of the reader, and your characters are only puppets. How could you write a real story? You've never lived.
Emily clenched her hands and bit her lips. She dared not trust her voice to say a single word. She had not felt like this since the night Ellen Green had told her her father must die. Her heart, that had beaten so tumultuously a few minutes ago, was like lead, heavy and cold. She turned and walked away from him. He limped softly after her and touched her shoulder.
Forgive me, Star. Isn't it better to know the truth? Stop reaching for the moon. You'll never get it. Why try to write anyway? Everything has already been written.
Someday, said Emily, compelling herself to speak steadily, I may be able to thank you for this. Tonight, I hate you.
Is that just? Asked Dean quietly.
No, of course it isn't just, said Emily wildly. Can you expect me to be just when you've just killed me? Oh, I know I asked for it. I know it's good for me. Horrible things always are good for you, I suppose. After you've been killed a few times, you don't mind it. But the first time one does. Squirm. Go away, Dean. Don't come back for a week at least. The funeral will be over then.
Don't you believe I know what this means to you, Star? Asked Dean pityingly.
You can't altogether. Oh, I know you're sympathetic. I don't want sympathy. I only want time to bury myself decently.
Dean, knowing it would be better to go, went. Emily watched him out of sight. Then she took up the little dog-eared, discredited manuscript he had laid on the stone bench, and went up to her room. She looked it over by her window in the fading light. Sentence after sentence leaped out at her. Witty, poignant, beautiful. No, that was only her fond, foolish, maternal delusion. There was nothing of the sort in the book. Dean had said so. And her book people, how she loved them, how real they seemed to her. It was terrible to think of destroying them, but they were not real, only puppets. Puppets would not mind being burned. She glanced up at the starlit sky of the autumn night. Vega of the Lyre shone bluely down upon her. Oh, life was an ugly, cruel, wasteful thing. Emily crossed over to her little fireplace and laid a cellar of dreams in the grate. She struck a match, knelt down and held it to a corner with a hand that did not tremble. The flame seized on the loose sheets eagerly, murderously. Emily clasped her hands over her heart and watched it with dilated eyes, remembering the time she had burned her old account book rather than let Aunt Elizabeth see it. In a few moments, the manuscript was a mass of rising fires. In a few more seconds, it was a heap of crinkled ashes, with here and there an accusing ghost sword coming out whitely on a blackened fragment as if to reproach her. Repentance seized upon her. Oh, why had she done it? Why had she burned her book? Suppose it was no good, still it was hers. It was wicked to have burned it. She had destroyed something incalculably precious to her. What did the mothers of old feel when their children had passed through the fire to Moloch, when the sacrificial impulse and excitement had gone? Emily thought she knew. Nothing of her book, her dear book that had seemed so wonderful to her, but ashes, a little pitiful heap of black ashes. Could it be so? Where had gone all the wit and laughter and charm that had seemed to glimmer in its pages, all the dear folks who had lived in them, all the secret delight she had woven into them as moonlight is woven among pines? Nothing left but ashes. Emily sprang up in such an anguish of regret that she could not endure it. She must get out, away, anywhere. Her little room, generally so dear and beloved and cozy, seemed like a prison. Out somewhere into the cold, free autumn night, with its gray ghost mists, away from walls and boundaries, away from that little heap of dark flakes in the grate, away from the reproachful ghosts of her murdered book folks. She flung open the door of the room and rushed blindly to the stair. Aunt Laura never to the day of her death forgave herself for leaving that mending basket at the head of the stair. She had never done such a thing in her life before. She had been carrying it up to her room when Elizabeth called peremptorily from the kitchen, asking where something was. Laura set her basket down on the top step and ran to get it. She was away only a moment, but that moment was enough for predestination and Emily. The tear-blinded girl stumbled over the basket and fell, headlong, down the long, steep staircase of New Moon. There was a moment of fear, a moment of wonderment. She felt plunged into deadly cold. She felt plunged into burning heat. She felt a soaring upward, a falling into unseen depths, a fierce stab of agony in her foot, then nothing more. When Laura and Elizabeth came running in, there was only a crumpled silken heap lying at the foot of the stairs, with balls and stockings all around it. And Aunt Laura's scissors bent and twisted under the foot they had so cruelly pierced.